Good morning to everyone. I'm Harvest evening. In case you could be watching anytime, good evening to you. Today we are going to talk about classical economic theory. Classical economic theory is what was basically believed by most economists up to the 1930s, even 1940s for many of them. And there are some people who still actually do believe in it, and it has a reappearance at times. For example, sometimes they repackage it as calling it the new classical theory or something of this type. Technically, it's not classical theory, it's neoclassical theory. And the reason behind the difference between the two of them is that classical theory is based upon the concept that labor is the entire source of wealth. Neoclassical theory is different in the sense that it bases value upon what people are willing to pay in exchange for something. So when we talk about Keynes, he'll always talk about the classical theorists. He really most of the time is referring to neoclassical, just for clarification. Classical theory is a kind of a mechanical system. It was kind of based upon the idea, how do you produce things? How do you save a little bit of money to produce even more in the future? And how do you distribute things after they've been produced? It was based upon, to a large degree, Say's law. John Baptiste Say, in the last, most certainly he is one of the most interesting of the earlier philosophers, but his argument was that supply creates its own demand. If you produce something, somebody will want to buy it. And if at first they don't want to buy it, the price will gradually decline to the point that people will want to buy it. So even if it is a relatively common commodity, it will sell, because eventually what will happen is the price will come down to the point that people will actually buy it. And everything does sell. That's the idea. Now, if people decide not to buy things currently, right now for consumption, well, that's okay too, because then they save the money. And according to John Baptiste's idea, and demand increases own supply increases own demand, what will happen in that case is that savings will occur. And as those savings occur, they become a supply of capital, and therefore it will create its own demand, and it will be translated into investment. So a reduction in current spending for commodities and greater savings causes a temporary change in the market, but not necessarily a disruption in this sense that we might talk about it today in a recession. It's a change of people's perception of wanting something later, to basically save for the future rather than consume currently. Basically, what that means is that savings equals investment. Now, notice what this does basically to the formula when we talk about the formula for GDP. GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government plus the sum of exports minus imports. Well, in the classical model, as consumption goes down, C takes a dive. What happens is I goes up, and there may be a short transition, but everything happens, and short transitions are recognized temporary recessions, and basically it rights itself relatively quickly. It is impossible long term for supply to exceed demand. Anytime the supply is too great, for example, if you have too many people working, the price will fall, wages will fall, and eventually people will basically purchase the supply because they can use it in one fashion or another. You just have to price it right. As prices fall for finished goods, suppliers will be unwilling to pay the same for labor. Therefore, labor prices, wages will drop. And as wages drop, That basically means that they can produce the supply for less money. And eventually, though, what it means is, even though it seems like laborers are losing out in this within the classical model, eventually they'd be okay, because even though they have reduced wages, the price of goods and services will also be less. Under this, of course, in the classical model, long-term unanticipated or long-term undesired unemployment is not possible. Labor will create its own supply. Now, the long-term aggregate supply curve, we'll talk about this more down the road, but the long-term aggregate supply curve is how much a society will produce or can produce at a given time. It's basically based upon the production possibility frontier. And in the classical model, it's seen as a vertical line. In other words, that's what we produce. That's normal. That's equilibrium. That's what we're going to produce. And you temporarily might be below that. You might temporarily be above that, but that is where you're supposed to be. The short-term aggregate GDP curve, however, does slope upwards and does curve upwards, and therefore you can have a temporary reduction in production. In the short term, of course, less usable resources may not be employed as they use the higher productive resources, but eventually what will happen is they will come around and all resources will be used. If you have a little overproduction at times, for example, in war, what will happen there is that you will overproduce relative to the normal. Students may not be going to school and you may not be getting vacations, but you will be able to produce more. But eventually what will happen is that it will return to the level of normal full production, because that is the point of normal equilibrium within the system. Note that this is a mechanical model again. It does not account for psychological reactions and other types of things of that type. Inflation is seen as basically a cause of decline in domestic spending. Things become more expensive, you have less purchasing power, therefore it is to be avoided if possible. This is like a God-given system. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's just, the economists envisioned this as being the normal, even though markets were relatively new when this theory was devised. It was almost seen as being something that God had given since the beginning of time. We just finally figured out how to use it. So what are some of the premises of it? Laissez-faire. In French, that means, hands off. Okay, don't do anything. This is self-regulated economy. Government should stay out of it. Unemployment results when wages are too high. Wages will come down. Just allow them to. Supply, again, creates its own demand. Aggregate demand will always be sufficient to purchase whatever is actually produced. They also believe in the quantity theory of money. Now, the quantity theory of money is that you take the total aggregate, number of items, goods, and services that are produced, and you multiply that times the average price for each of these things. That's going to be equal to the money supply and the number of times that money supply turns over in a year. Now, this is definitional. This is actually a definitional thing. That, of course, does exist. The difference was that within the classical theory, there was the assumption of veil of money, that money had no special properties, and therefore it could not affect the other things. Q was fixed. Well, if you look at the formula and think about the formula, you can write it down again. It's P times Q is equal M times V. If you say that Q is fixed, and then you basically increase the money supply, and you assume that velocity of money is fixed, which they also assumed, that means that increasing the money supply will do nothing but drive up prices, which means it was undesirable. Other type of things is that the directional causation, and within all these assumptions, is that the money supply changes prices, not the other way around. That's the direction of causation. Now, as you kind of go through this, you need to go back and read through this in terms of your text and the module. You'll understand that this theory kind of makes sense if you look at it from a perspective of where they were coming from at the time. They were just interested in trying to figure out how to produce things. They didn't think in terms of how do you make sure the system is maintained, because they assumed that the system would automatically correct itself. Long-term involuntary unemployment wasn't a possibility. Recessions could occur, but because supply increases on demand, long-term recessions are also basically impossible. Of course, when the Great Depression hit, lots and lots of people began to question whether or not this was a correct model. Thank you very much. I hope this is something that is useful. Most certainly use it in conjunction with your module and your text. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.